They called us word weavers with contempt, believing our love for negotiation was weakness. The Zephyrian Collective had crushed 17 civilizations through pure military might, their crystalline warships leaving nothing but cosmic dust in their wake. To them, humanity's reputation for endless talking, for finding common ground where others saw only conflict, marked us as easy prey. The galaxy's most feared conquerors had never encountered a species that could turn language itself into a weapon of mass destruction. When Ambassador Sarah Chen stepped into that final diplomatic chamber, carrying nothing but a briefcase of words, she didn't know she was about to unleash humanity's most terrifying capability, the power to convince entire civilizations to destroy themselves with nothing more than carefully chosen sentences. Some wars are fought with plasma cannons and antimatter bombs. Others are won with whispered truths that shatter minds and topple empires. This is the story of how humanity's greatest strength became the galaxy's greatest nightmare. Ambassador Sarah Chen stood before the obsidian mirror in her quarters aboard the diplomatic vessel Harmony's Edge, adjusting the collar of her formal envoy robes for what she knew might be the last time. The deep blue fabric, embroidered with Earth's golden wheat stalks and olive branches, felt heavier than usual. Behind her, the stars wheeled slowly as the ship approached the neutral meeting point in the Kepler-Best Chali 442 system. Final diplomatic transmission from Earth Command, Ambassador, announced Lieutenant Torres from the doorway, his young face grave with the weight of what everyone aboard suspected was a suicide mission. Sarah turned to accept the encrypted data pad, her fingers steadied despite the magnitude of what lay ahead. The Zephyrian Collective had agreed to this meeting only after destroying the outer colonies of New Geneva and Prosperity Station, leaving behind their signature calling cards, perfectly spherical craters where thriving human settlements once stood, and crystalline monuments bearing the simple message in 100 languages: submit or join the dust. Thank you, Lieutenant. Any word from the other species? The Altarian Republic sends their regrets. The vegan trade union has gone silent. The Centauri Alliance. Torres paused, swallowing hard. They've already begun evacuation procedures for their core worlds. Sarah nodded, understanding the subtext. Humanity stood alone, as they had so many times before in their brief but tumultuous galactic history. The difference was that this time, there would be no miraculous last-minute rescue, no hidden trump card, no secret weapon that could match the Zephyrians' overwhelming military superiority. All they had were words. The data pad came to life under her touch, displaying the final message from Director Martinez of Earth's Diplomatic Corps. Sarah had served under Martinez for 12 years, ever since humanity's first contact with the galactic community. She had negotiated trade agreements with the silicon-based Christech, prevented 3 separate wars between the feuding Andromedan city-states, and somehow convinced the xenophobic Rigel Confederacy to allow human medical ships passage through their territory during the Tau Ceti plague outbreak. Sarah, Martinez's recorded voice began, his usually composed demeanor cracked with exhaustion. I won't insult your intelligence by pretending this mission has any conventional chance of success. The Zephyrians have conquered 17 civilizations in the past 2 centuries. Their military doctrine is simple: total annihilation of any species that refuses immediate subjugation. They don't negotiate. They don't compromise. They certainly don't show mercy. The recording paused as Martinez took a shaky breath. But you're not going there to save humanity through normal diplomacy. You're going there to test something we've been developing since first contact. Something the other species have never seen us use because we've never needed to. The Psychological Warfare Division calls it Project Cassandra, though I think that name undersells what you'll be carrying. Sarah's eyebrows rose. She'd heard whispers of Cassandra in the classified briefings, rumors of a new approach to conflict resolution that went far beyond traditional negotiation techniques. But the details had been kept locked away even from the Diplomatic Corps' senior ambassadors. In your briefcase, you'll find detailed psychological profiles of every known Zephyrian leader, compiled from 3 decades of deep space surveillance, communication intercepts, and behavioral analysis. More importantly, you'll find the fruits of our Xenopsychology Department's most ambitious project, a complete understanding of how the Zephyrian mind processes information, forms beliefs, and makes decisions. The recording shifted, and Sarah could see Martinez leaning forward, his eyes intense with something between hope and fear. Sarah, humanity's gift has never been superior technology or overwhelming force. Our gift is language. Not just words, but the ability to take complex ideas and embed them so deeply in other minds that they become indistinguishable from original thought. We've been practicing this art for millennia, through religion, philosophy, literature, propaganda, advertising, therapy, and yes, diplomacy. Torres cleared his throat softly from the doorway. Ambassador, we'll reach the rendezvous point in 30 minutes. Sarah nodded, continuing to listen as Martinez's voice took on an urgent edge. What I'm asking you to do has never been attempted on this scale. You're not going to negotiate with the Zephyrians. You're going to reprogram them. Every argument you make, every story you tell, every seemingly innocent observation you offer will be designed to introduce what we call cognitive viruses into their belief systems. The screen shifted to display complex diagrams showing neural pathway mappings and psychological influence matrices. Sarah studied them with the intensity of a general reviewing battle plans, because that's exactly what they were. The beauty of this approach, Martinez continued, is that it turns their greatest strength against them. The Zephyrians have conquered so many civilizations because they think in absolute terms. Their minds are incredibly efficient at processing hierarchical information and making rapid, decisive judgments. They see the universe in terms of superior and inferior, conqueror and conquered, with no middle ground. Sarah began to understand the elegant brutality of the plan, but that rigid thinking makes them vulnerable to certain types of logical paradoxes and recursive thought patterns, she murmured, reading ahead in the files. Exactly. A human mind, accustomed to contradiction and ambiguity, can hold multiple conflicting ideas simultaneously without breaking down. We live with cognitive dissonance every day, but the Zephyrian mind, optimized for clear hierarchical thinking, becomes unstable when forced to process truly paradoxical concepts. They literally cannot handle ideas that challenge their fundamental understanding of order and dominance. The briefing materials contained hundreds of carefully crafted arguments, each one designed to introduce a small logical inconsistency into Zephyrian thinking. Individually, each argument would seem reasonable, even compelling. Together, they would create a cascade of doubt that would undermine the very foundations of Zephyrian society. Remember, Martinez's voice continued, you're not trying to convince them to spare humanity out of mercy. You're trying to convince them that destroying humanity would actually prove their inferiority. You're going to make them believe that true superiority lies not in conquest, but in the ability to create rather than destroy. And once that idea takes root in their hierarchical minds, it will spread through their entire power structure like a virus. Sarah closed the datapad and walked to the small viewport in her quarters. Outside, the stars seemed to pulse with the rhythm of her heartbeat. Somewhere out there, the Zephyrian fleet waited, 300 crystalline dreadnoughts that could reduce Earth to molten slag in a matter of hours. And she was going to try to defeat them with nothing but words. The irony wasn't lost on her. Humanity had spent centuries learning to communicate with alien species by adapting their own language and thought patterns to accommodate other forms of consciousness. Now they were going to use that same skill to engage in the most sophisticated form of psychological warfare ever conceived. A soft chime indicated an incoming transmission from the Zephyrian flagship Dominion Absolute. Sarah composed herself, activating the communication array in her quarters. The screen flickered to life, revealing the imposing figure of Fleet Commander HFY, the Zephyrian officer who had personally overseen the destruction of the last 3 civilizations to resist their advance. HFY stood nearly 3 meters tall, his crystalline exoskeleton refracting the harsh lighting of his command bridge into prismatic patterns that hurt human eyes to look at directly. His forearms moved in perfect coordination as he manipulated control interfaces that seemed to grow from the walls themselves. When he spoke, his voice carried the harmonic resonance that marked all Zephyrian communication, a sound like crystal bells ringing underwater. Human Ambassador Chen, he began, each word precisely enunciated in Earth Standard. You arrive at the specified coordinates with admirable punctuality. This speaks well of your species' capacity for basic order, though it changes nothing regarding your inevitable fate. Fleet Commander HFY, Sarah replied, inclining her head in the respectful greeting gesture that Zephyrian culture demanded. I thank you for agreeing to this meeting. Your reputation for honor and negotiation precedes you across the galaxy. It was a carefully calculated lie. The Zephyrians had no reputation for negotiation because they had never negotiated with anyone. But Sarah was planting the first seed, the idea that HFY was known for something other than pure destruction, that his identity could encompass concepts beyond military conquest. HFY's crystalline features remained impassive, but Sarah caught a slight hesitation in his harmonic pattern, the first sign that the cognitive virus was already beginning its work. Honor is found in strength, he replied, but the response came a fraction of a second slower than it should have. suggesting his mind was processing the contradiction between his known actions and the reputation she had attributed to him. Indeed, Sarah agreed. And true strength, as the ancient Zephyrian philosophers wrote, lies in the ability to create order from chaos, not merely to impose silence where there was once noise. Another calculated risk. Sarah was betting that Zixei, like most military commanders, had been educated in his species' classical literature and philosophy. The quote she'd referenced was from the Zephyrian text Principles of Crystalline Thought, but she had subtly altered its meaning. The original passage spoke of imposing order through force. Her version suggested that true order came from understanding and harmony. This time, Zixei's hesitation was more pronounced. His forearms shifted positions, and the harmonic quality of his voice changed slightly. You speak of texts few non-Zephyrians have studied, Ambassador. This suggests either significant preparation or unfortunate presumption. I have prepared extensively, Sarah admitted, allowing a note of what seemed like vulnerability to enter her voice. Your people's intellectual achievements have always fascinated me. The way Zephyrian minds can process complex hierarchical relationships simultaneously is truly remarkable. It's no wonder that your civilization has achieved such consistency in its approach to galactic affairs. The word consistency was another precisely placed cognitive mine. On the surface, it seemed like praise for Zephyrian efficiency and military success, but embedded within the compliment was a suggestion that perhaps consistency might also be a limitation, that a truly superior civilization might demonstrate the flexibility to change tactics when circumstances warranted it. Consistency is strength, Zixei replied, but Sarah noticed that his posture had shifted slightly. The commander's primary arms were now positioned in what Zephyrian body language experts had identified as a defensive configuration. Absolutely, Sarah agreed, with apparent enthusiasm. Consistency allows for predictable outcomes, which is essential for maintaining order. I confess, though, that I've always been curious about one aspect of Zephyrian military doctrine. The complete destruction of conquered civilizations seems wasteful, not inefficient, of course. I would never presume to question Zephyrian tactical superiority. But I wonder if such total elimination might actually represent a form of limitation rather than strength. Zixei's harmonic patterns shifted again, this time taking on what Sarah recognized as an interrogative tone. Explain this concept, human. Sarah leaned forward slightly, adopting the posture of someone sharing a profound insight. Consider this. Any civilization can destroy. Even the most primitive species can eliminate what they encounter. It requires only superior force. But the ability to transform, to take a chaotic or inferior system and elevate it to a higher order of existence, that requires a level of sophistication that goes far beyond mere military might. She paused, allowing the idea to settle in Zixei's mind like sediment in still water. I've always wondered if the truly superior civilizations, the ones that transcend mere conquest to achieve genuine cosmic significance, might be those that demonstrate their supremacy not by destroying inferior species, but by lifting them up. After all, what greater proof of superiority could there be than the ability to create order and purpose where none existed before? The silence that followed stretched for nearly 30 seconds. Sarah could see Zixei processing the argument, his crystalline features reflecting complex patterns of light as his mind worked through the implications. He had just suggested that the Zephyrians' greatest military achievements might actually be proof of their limitations rather than their strength. More importantly, she had done so in a way that framed the alternative, showing mercy to conquered species as a demonstration of even greater power and superiority. When Zixei finally spoke, his harmonic pattern had changed again, taking on a quality Sarah's briefing materials identified as thoughtful contemplation. You propose an interesting paradox, Ambassador. You suggest that destruction is the action of the weak, while transformation is the province of the strong. I propose nothing, Sarah replied carefully. I merely observe that in studying Zephyrian civilization, I've been struck by the sophistication of your social structures, the elegance of your philosophical traditions, and the remarkable efficiency of your technological achievements. These are the products of minds capable of incredible creativity and organizational brilliance. And yet, when I look at your military conquests, I see only emptiness. Silence where there was once complexity. It seems almost beneath you. The final phrase was delivered with perfect innocence, but it carried a payload designed to destabilize everything Zixei thought he knew about Zephyrian superiority. Sarah was suggesting that their military doctrine was actually unworthy of their intellectual capabilities, that they were, in effect, underachieving. Zixei's forearms moved in a complex pattern that Sarah recognized as deep concentration. When he spoke again, his voice carried a new quality. Uncertainty where there had been absolute confidence.
The concept you describe.
Transformation rather than elimination would require considerable analysis of its practical applications. Sarah nodded solemnly. Of course, such a radical shift in strategic thinking would need to be thoroughly examined by minds of exceptional capability. The kind of intellectual rigor that has made Zephyrian civilization the dominant force in this galaxy. He was stroking his ego while simultaneously planting the suggestion that the truly intelligent response would be to consider alternatives to their current approach. More importantly, she was establishing the framework for the psychological trap that would follow. Fleet Commander, she continued, I find myself in a unique position as the representative of what you obviously consider an inferior species. I should be terrified right now. By all logic, I should be begging for mercy or offering tribute in exchange for a quick death. Zixai's harmonic patterns sharpened with interest.
Indeed, your behavior is anomalous.
But I'm not afraid, Sarah said, allowing a small smile to cross her face. Not because I doubt your power. Your military supremacy is obvious and absolute. I'm not afraid because I believe that when you truly understand what humanity represents, you'll realize that destroying us would actually diminish rather than enhance Zephyrian greatness. She stood slowly, her movements deliberate and non-threatening, and walked to the viewport where the first of the Zephyrian ships was becoming visible in the distance. The crystalline vessel was beautiful in its lethal perfection, its faceted hull catching and amplifying the light from the system's star until it blazed like a sword made of concentrated starfire. Would you like to know why I believe that, Fleet Commander? The transmission ended with Zixai's agreement to continue the conversation aboard his flagship, exactly as Sarah had hoped. As the Harmony's Edge began its approach to the Zephyrian fleet, Sarah allowed herself a moment of cautious optimism. The first phase of Project Cassandra was complete. She had successfully introduced the initial set of cognitive viruses into Zixai's thinking, and his reaction suggested that the psychological profile of Zephyrian mental processes was accurate. But the real test was yet to come. Soon she would be alone aboard an enemy vessel, surrounded by beings who could kill her with a thought, carrying nothing but words in the desperate hope that humanity's greatest gift, the ability to change minds through language, would prove stronger than the galaxy's most feared military machine. As the docking bay of the Dominion Absolute grew larger in the viewport, Sarah Chen prepared to enter the most important conversation in human history. The interior of the Zephyrian flagship defied every expectation Sarah had formed about alien warships. Instead of the sterile metal corridors and harsh lighting she anticipated, she found herself walking through what could only be described as a living crystal palace. The walls pulsed with soft, organic light that seemed to respond to her heartbeat, while the floor beneath her feet hummed with barely perceptible harmonic frequencies that made her bones vibrate in sympathy. Commander Zixai glided beside her, his forearms moving in precise patterns that Sarah now recognized as a form of continuous communication with the ship's systems. Every surface around them was alive with data streams that flowed like liquid light through crystalline conduits, creating a three-dimensional interface that made human-computer technology seem primitive by comparison.
Your vessel is magnificent, Sarah said, and meant it.
I've studied the technical specifications of Zephyrian ships, but experiencing this in person, it's like walking inside a living organism. The Dominion Absolute is the finest expression of our technological mastery, Zixai replied, his harmonic voice carrying a note of pride. Every system is integrated into a single consciousness that responds to thought as well as command. It is the perfect synthesis of organic intuition and mechanical precision. Sarah filed away the phrase organic intuition for later use. It suggested that the Zephyrians valued biological thinking processes alongside their crystalline technology, another potential point of leverage for her psychological warfare campaign. They passed through a series of chambers that served as living quarters for the ship's crew. Through transparent walls, Sarah glimpsed Zephyrian officers engaged in activities that seemed almost meditative. Some stood motionless before complex light displays, their crystalline bodies resonating with the patterns in ways that suggested direct neural interface. Others moved in slow, ritualized dances that appeared to be forms of exercise or worship. Your crew seems remarkably calm for soldiers about to engage in warfare, Sarah observed. Zephyrian military doctrine requires absolute mental clarity, Zixai explained. Emotional turbulence creates disharmony in the ship's systems. Our warriors achieve peak efficiency through the elimination of internal conflict. Another useful piece of information. The Zephyrians were psychologically dependent on mental harmony and clarity. Introduce enough cognitive dissonance, and their entire military structure would begin to break down from within. They arrived at what Zixei identified as the ship's central command nexus, a spherical chamber whose walls, ceiling, and floor were entirely transparent, creating the illusion of floating in space surrounded by stars. The effect was breathtaking and disorienting, forcing Sarah to focus on the crystalline platform at the chamber's center to maintain her balance. "This is where all strategic decisions are made," Zixei said, gesturing to control interfaces that seemed to grow from the platform itself. "From here, the fleet's actions are coordinated through direct neural link. Each ship captain's consciousness merges with the collective tactical intelligence, creating perfect unity of purpose." Sarah studied the setup with apparent fascination, but her mind was racing through the implications. The Zephyrian fleet wasn't just a collection of individual ships, it was a single organism with distributed intelligence. Any psychological disruption introduced at the command level would propagate throughout the entire structure. "Unity of purpose," she mused aloud. "That's a fascinating concept. In human military theory, we often debate the relative merits of centralized versus distributed command structures, but what you're describing goes beyond either approach. It's like achieving the benefits of both simultaneously." "Precisely," Zixei said, moving to the center of the platform. As he did, the chamber around them came alive with tactical displays showing the positions of every ship in the fleet. Inferior species make the error of treating warfare as a collection of individual conflicts. We understand that true military superiority comes from perfect coordination at every level. "I can see the elegance in that approach," Sarah agreed, though I confess it raises an interesting question about the nature of victory itself. Zixei's harmonic pattern shifted to an interrogative frequency. "Explain." Sarah moved slowly around the edge of the platform, her hands clasped behind her back in what she hoped appeared to be respectful contemplation. "Well, when every action is perfectly coordinated, when every decision flows from a single unified consciousness, the victory belongs to the collective rather than to any individual commander. In a sense, personal achievement becomes impossible." She paused, allowing the observation to settle. "I've been wondering whether that might actually represent a form of limitation. After all, the greatest military leaders in galactic history, the ones remembered across centuries, were individuals who demonstrated exceptional personal brilliance in the face of chaos and uncertainty." Zixei's forearms moved in a complex pattern that Sarah's briefing materials identified as analytical processing. "You suggest that perfect coordination diminishes rather than enhances military achievement?" "I suggest that perfection might be the enemy of greatness," Sarah replied carefully. "Consider the legendary battles that are still studied in military academies across the galaxy. The Andromedan defense of Sigma Draconis, where Admiral Kethril held off a superior force through tactical improvisation. The Battle of the Vegan Nebula, where Commander Singh turned certain defeat into victory by defying standard protocols and trusting her intuition." She turned to face Zixei directly. "These victories are remembered precisely because they involved individuals making brilliant decisions under impossible circumstances. They demonstrated that consciousness, individual, creative, sometimes illogical consciousness, could overcome mechanical superiority." "And you believe this applies to our current situation?" Zixei asked, his harmonic pattern taking on what Sarah recognized as a challenging tone. "I believe," Sarah said slowly, "that truly superior beings would want their victories to be worthy of their capabilities. When a perfect machine defeats an inferior opponent, what has really been proven? But when an individual consciousness makes choices that transcend the merely logical, that achieves something that no amount of coordination could have predicted, that's when greatness reveals itself." She was walking a fine line now, simultaneously praising Zephyrian capabilities while suggesting that their current approach to warfare might be beneath their potential. More importantly, she was introducing the idea that individual agency and creative thinking might be superior to collective coordination. Zixei stood motionless for nearly a minute, his crystalline body refracting the tactical displays into complex patterns of light and color. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quality Sarah had never heard before, uncertainty mixed with something that might have been longing. "You speak of individual achievement as though it were superior to collective perfection. This contradicts fundamental principles of Zephyrian military doctrine." "I'm not questioning your doctrine," Sarah said quickly. "I'm simply observing that the greatest military minds in galactic history have always been individuals who found ways to transcend the limitations of their own species' conventional thinking. They became great not by following perfect systems, but by having the courage to improvise when perfection wasn't enough." She moved to the edge of the platform, gazing out at the assembled fleet through the transparent walls. "Look at what you've accomplished, Commander. 300 ships operating in perfect coordination, each one capable of reducing a planet to atoms. It's magnificent, and it's absolutely effective against any conventional opponent.
But
Zixei prompted, somehow sensing the direction of her thoughts.
humanity isn't a conventional opponent,
Sarah said softly. We're not trying to match your technological superiority or your military coordination. We can't. You've already proven that you're better at both. Instead, we're doing what humans have always done when faced with impossible odds. We're changing the rules of the game. She turned back to face him, her expression serious but not confrontational. I'm here because my species believes that you're intelligent enough to understand what we're really offering. Not surrender. You don't need our surrender to defeat us. Not tribute. What could we possibly offer that you couldn't simply take? We're offering you the chance to achieve something that pure military conquest never could. The opportunity to transform an entire species through the power of ideas rather than force. Zixei's harmonic pattern became almost musical, cycling through complex tones that suggested rapid mental processing. You propose that sparing your species would somehow enhance rather than diminish our victory. I propose that the ability to take a chaotic, individualistic, seemingly inferior species like humanity and guide them to a higher state of existence would be a demonstration of power that goes far beyond anything you've achieved through military conquest alone, Sarah replied. She was introducing one of the most dangerous cognitive viruses yet. The idea that the Zephyrians' current achievements, impressive as they were, might actually be limiting them, that their pursuit of perfect military domination was preventing them from achieving something even greater. Consider what you've told me about your ship's consciousness, she continued. The perfect integration of organic intuition and mechanical precision. That's exactly the kind of synthesis that could transform humanity from a chaotic collection of individuals into something resembling true civilization.
He suggests that we could
Elevate your species? Zixei asked, his tone suggesting that the idea had never occurred to him before. I suggest that you're the only species in the galaxy with the intellectual sophistication to attempt such a transformation, Sarah said. Any civilization can destroy, most can conquer and subjugate, but how many could take a species like humanity, stubborn, creative, individually minded, and guide them to achieve something approaching Zephyrian levels of harmony and purpose? She was flattering his ego while simultaneously reframing the entire conflict. Instead of a simple military conquest, she was presenting the situation as an opportunity for the Zephyrians to prove their superiority through an act of creation rather than destruction. Such an undertaking would require considerable time and effort, Zixei said slowly. Absolutely, Sarah agreed. It would be far more challenging than simple elimination. It would require patience, wisdom, and a level of understanding that goes beyond military tactics. It would be a test of Zephyrian capabilities that no other species has ever attempted. She paused, letting the implication sink in. Of course, if you believed that such a challenge would be beyond even Zephyrian abilities, the reaction was immediate and exactly what Sarah had hoped for. Zixei's harmonic pattern sharpened to an almost aggressive frequency, and his four arms moved in patterns that clearly indicated defensive posturing. No challenge would be beyond Zephyrian capabilities, he stated firmly. We have brought order to 17 different species across 2 centuries of expansion. By destroying them, Sarah pointed out gently, which again demonstrates tremendous military power. But has any species ever voluntarily chosen to transform themselves according to Zephyrian principles? Has any civilization ever been so inspired by the superiority of your culture that they abandoned their chaotic ways and embraced crystalline perfection of their own accord? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah was asking whether the Zephyrians had ever achieved anything more sophisticated than fear-based compliance, whether they had ever truly convinced another species that Zephyrian ways were superior, rather than simply forcing them to submit or die. Zixei's silence was answer enough. Humanity could be your first, Sarah continued. Not your first conquest. You have plenty of those. Your first true conversion. The first species to choose transformation over resistance, not because they feared your weapons, but because they were genuinely convinced that Zephyrian civilization represented a higher form of existence. She moved closer to the command platform, her voice taking on an almost conspiratorial tone. Think about what that would mean for your place in galactic history, Commander. Not just another military victory, but proof that Zephyrian principles are so superior that they can transform even the most chaotic species through pure persuasion. The chamber fell silent, except for the soft, harmonic humming of the ship's systems. Sarah could see Zixei processing the argument, his crystalline features reflecting the tactical displays and patterns that seemed to mirror the complexity of his thoughts. Finally he spoke, his voice carrying a quality that Sarah had never heard from a Zephyrian before. Genuine curiosity mixed with something that might have been excitement. Such a transformation would indeed represent an unprecedented achievement, but it would require that your species demonstrate the capacity for genuine change, not mere compliance born of fear.
Agreed, Sarah said immediately. Empty submission would prove nothing.
But if humanity could be guided to genuinely embrace Zephyrian principles, if we could learn to value harmony over chaos, collective purpose over individual ambition, that would be something entirely new in galactic history. She was walking deeper into dangerous territory now, offering to essentially help the Zephyrians subjugate her own species. But Sarah was counting on the psychological profile being accurate, that Zephyrian minds would be more attracted to the intellectual challenge of transformation than the simple brutality of destruction. You speak as though you believe such a change would be beneficial for your species, HFY observed. I speak as someone who has studied Zephyrian civilization extensively, Sarah replied. Your social structures eliminate waste and conflict. Your technological achievements represent the perfect marriage of efficiency and elegance. Your philosophical traditions provide clear guidance for achieving harmony and purpose. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. Honestly, Commander, after spending years trying to resolve disputes between chaotic, individualistic human colonies, the idea of a society where everyone understands their place and works toward common goals is appealing. It was another calculated risk, presenting herself as someone who might genuinely prefer Zephyrian order to human chaos. If HFY believed her, it would make her arguments seem more credible and less like desperate negotiation tactics.
And you believe other humans would share this perspective, he asked?
I believe that humans are pragmatic, Sarah said. When presented with clear evidence of a superior way of organizing society, most would recognize the benefits. The key would be presenting the transformation as an opportunity for improvement, rather than a form of subjugation. HFY moved to one of the control interfaces, his hands dancing over crystalline controls that responded to his touch with cascades of harmonic tones. The tactical display around them shifted, showing detailed information about human colonies and population centers. The process you describe would require careful planning and exceptional subtlety, he said. It would be far more complex than standard conquest protocols, which is exactly why it would be worthy of Zephyrian intelligence, Sarah replied. Anyone with enough ships can destroy a planet, but guiding an entire species toward voluntary transformation? That would require a level of sophistication that only the most advanced civilizations could achieve. She was pushing him toward the conclusion she wanted, that attempting to transform rather than destroy humanity would be a greater test of Zephyrian superiority than simple military conquest. More importantly, she was encouraging him to see the situation as an intellectual challenge rather than a military operation. There would need to be safeguards, HFY said thoughtfully, mechanisms to ensure that the transformation was genuine rather than superficial compliance. Absolutely, Sarah agreed. The process would need to be carefully monitored and guided, perhaps beginning with select human colonies that showed the greatest aptitude for adapting to Zephyrian principles.
She was now actively collaborating with him on plans to subjugate her own species.
But every suggestion was designed to slow down the Zephyrian war machine and create opportunities for the psychological viruses to spread through their command structure. This conversation has introduced concepts that require deeper analysis, HFY announced after several minutes of contemplation. I must consult with the Fleet Council before any decisions regarding your species can be made. Sarah nodded solemnly. Of course, a decision of this magnitude deserves the full attention of Zephyrian leadership. Take all the time you need, Commander. After all, if this transformation is going to succeed, it needs to be approached with the kind of careful planning and intellectual rigor that has made Zephyrian civilization the dominant force in this galaxy. As they prepared to leave the command nexus, Sarah allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The second phase of Project Cassandra was complete. She had successfully introduced the idea that destroying humanity would actually be a sign of Zephyrian limitation, while transforming them would represent the ultimate proof of superiority. More importantly, she had convinced HFY to involve the Fleet Council in the decision-making process. Every additional Zephyrian leader who was exposed to these arguments would become another vector for spreading the cognitive viruses throughout their command structure. The real test would come when she faced the entire Zephyrian leadership. That's when she would deploy the most dangerous psychological weapon humanity had ever conceived, an idea so perfectly crafted to exploit the contradictions in Zephyrian thinking that it would either save her species or trigger the complete collapse of one of the galaxy's most powerful civilizations. The Fleet Council chamber was a monument to crystalline perfection that took Sarah's breath away. 7 towering pillars of living crystal rose from the floor like frozen lightning, each one pulsing with its own harmonic frequency. The pillars formed a perfect heptagon around a central platform where Sarah now stood, surrounded by the most powerful military leaders in Zephyrian space. Each pillar contained the consciousness of a fleet hierarch, their crystalline forms visible within the translucent structures like insects trapped in amber. But these beings were far from trapped. They were connected to vast networks of information and tactical analysis that made them living extensions of Zephyrian military power. Hierarch Prime Zethnos occupied the tallest pillar directly in front of Sarah. His form was ancient by Zephyrian standards, his crystal body showing the distinctive facing patterns that mark centuries of accumulated wisdom and authority. When he spoke, his harmonic voice carried undertones that resonated in Sarah's bones, making her feel as though she were listening to the fundamental frequency of the universe itself. Human Ambassador Chen, Zethnos began, his words carefully measured and formal. Fleet Commander Zixai has presented your proposal to this council. We find ourselves in the unprecedented situation of considering alternatives to immediate military resolution. Sarah inclined her head respectfully, fighting to maintain her composure despite the overwhelming presence of the assembled hierarchs. I am honored by your willingness to consider new approaches, Hierarch Prime. Your reputation for strategic wisdom extends far beyond Zephyrian space. Flattery serves no purpose here, interjected Hierarch Kylthax from the pillar to Sarah's left. His harmonic pattern carried aggressive undertones that made the air itself seem to vibrate with barely controlled violence. You speak to military commanders who have reduced 17 civilizations to cosmic dust. Your words cannot alter the reality of your species' inevitable fate. Sarah turned toward Kylthax, her expression remaining calm and respectful. You're absolutely correct, Hierarch Kylthax. My words cannot change the military reality of this situation. Your fleet could destroy every human world within days, and there's nothing I could say or do to prevent that outcome. She paused, allowing the acknowledgement to settle before continuing. But I'm not here to change what you can do. I'm here to ask whether what you can do is the same as what you should do. A harmonic dissonance rippled through the chamber as the 7 hierarchs processed this distinction. Sarah had just separated capability from purpose, force from wisdom, introducing a subtle but crucial cognitive division into their thinking. Elaborate, commanded Hierarch Prime Zethnos. With respect, Hierarch Prime, your military capabilities are beyond question. You have demonstrated time and again that Zephyrian forces can overcome any opposition, destroy any defense, eliminate any threat to your expansion. In purely tactical terms, you are perfect instruments of warfare. Sarah began walking slowly around the central platform, addressing each hierarch in turn as she spoke. But I've studied the history of your conquests, and I've noticed something that puzzles me. After 2 centuries of perfect military victories, the Zephyrian collective controls vast territories, but rules over silence. Empty systems where complex civilizations once thrived. She stopped in front of Hierarch Vox Mari, whose pillar pulsed with deep blue harmonics that suggested analytical contemplation. Hierarch Vox Mari, your strategic analyses are legendary throughout the galaxy. Tell me, what is the ultimate purpose of conquest? Vox Mari's harmonic patterns shifted to a teaching frequency, suggesting that Sarah had struck upon a topic of genuine interest. Conquest serves to expand the influence of superior civilization over inferior chaos. Through military dominance, we establish zones of crystalline order, where previously there existed only discord and waste. A perfect answer, Sarah agreed, then tilted her head slightly in apparent confusion. But if the purpose is to expand crystalline order, why eliminate the very populations that could benefit from Zephyrian guidance? Doesn't destruction actually prevent the achievement of your stated goal? The question hung in the chamber like a discordant note in an otherwise perfect symphony. Sarah had just pointed out a fundamental contradiction in Zephyrian doctrine. They claimed to spread order through conquest, but their method of conquest eliminated the very beings who could experience that order. Hierarch Kylthax's aggressive harmonics intensified. Inferior species cannot comprehend true order. They are eliminated to prevent contamination of crystalline perfection. But that assumes contamination is inevitable, Sarah countered gently. What if it's not? What if inferior species could be elevated to appreciate crystalline perfection rather than contaminating it? She turned to address the entire council, her voice taking on the tone of someone sharing a profound realization. I've been thinking about this problem since my arrival, and I believe I understand why no other species has attempted what I'm about to propose. It's because no other species possesses the intellectual sophistication necessary to attempt true transformation rather than simple domination. You suggest that we lack the capability for such transformation? Hierarch Zethnos asked, his harmonic pattern carrying dangerous undertones. Quite the opposite, Sarah said quickly. I suggest that you're the only species that could possibly succeed at such a challenge. Consider what transformation would require. Perfect understanding of inferior thought patterns, flawless strategic planning, absolute mastery of psychological principles, and the wisdom to guide rather than simply command. She was stroking their collective ego while simultaneously presenting transformation as a greater challenge than conquest. More importantly, she was suggesting that their current approach, destruction, might actually be the easier path rather than the superior one. The military conquest of humanity would take days, Sarah continued. But the intellectual challenge of transforming us into something worthy of the crystalline order? That would require years of careful work, unprecedented strategic thinking, and a level of understanding that goes far beyond anything achieved through simple warfare. Hierarch Nyxandra, who had remained silent until now, spoke from her pillar with harmonics that suggested deep contemplation. You speak of transformation as though it were more difficult than elimination. This contradicts standard strategic analysis. Does it? Sarah asked, moving closer to Nyxandra's pillar. Hierarch Nyxandra, your expertise in behavioral modification protocols is well known. Tell me, which requires greater skill. Destroying a complex system or modifying it to function according to new parameters. Nyxandra's harmonic patterns shifted through several frequencies before settling on what Sarah recognized as academic interest. Modification of complex systems requires comprehensive understanding of all component interactions, whereas destruction requires only sufficient force applied to critical structural points.
Exactly, Sarah said with apparent excitement.
Destruction is elegant in its simplicity. You identify weak points and apply overwhelming force. But transformation requires you to understand the system so completely that you can guide its evolution toward desired outcomes while maintaining its essential functionality.
She was reframing the entire military situation as an intellectual challenge.
Instead of presenting humanity as prey to be eliminated, she was positioning them as a complex problem to be solved, one that would test Zephyrian capabilities far more thoroughly than simple conquest ever could.
You propose that attempting to transform humanity would be a greater test of our abilities than eliminating your species,
Hierarch Prime Zethnos said slowly.
I propose that any civilization capable of the kind of transformation you could achieve with humanity would be demonstrating a level of superiority that transcends mere military dominance, Sarah replied. After all, what's more impressive, having enough power to destroy something or having enough understanding to perfect it? The chamber fell silent except for the complex harmonics of the 7 pillars as the hierarchs processed this argument. Sarah was asking them to choose between proving their superiority through force or proving it through wisdom, and she was suggesting that force was actually the less impressive option.
Such a transformation would require unprecedented cooperation from the target species, observed Hierarch Voxmary.
Humans would need to voluntarily abandon their chaotic individualism in favor of crystalline order. Which brings me to the most remarkable aspect of this opportunity, Sarah said, her voice taking on a tone of genuine wonder. Hierarch Voxmary, you're absolutely right that transformation requires cooperation, but consider what that means in practical terms. She moved to the center of the platform, addressing all 7 hierarchs simultaneously. Every species you've encountered has chosen resistance over submission. They've forced you to prove your superiority through military action because they couldn't recognize the inherent value of crystalline civilization. Sarah paused, allowing the observation to sink in before delivering her most dangerous argument yet. But what if humanity chose differently? What if we became the first species to voluntarily embrace transformation because we recognize that Zephyrian civilization represents a genuinely superior way of existing? The harmonics in the chamber shifted dramatically as the implications of her suggestion rippled through the council's collective consciousness. Sarah was proposing that humanity's voluntary cooperation would actually prove Zephyrian superiority more convincingly than any military victory ever could. Voluntary transformation would indeed represent an unprecedented achievement, admitted Hierarch Prime Zethnos. No species has ever chosen submission without first being defeated in battle. Because no species has ever been intelligent enough to recognize superior civilization when they encountered it, Sarah said, her voice carrying what seemed like genuine admiration. But humanity is different. We're a young species, still learning our place in the galaxy. We have the flexibility to adapt, to change, to evolve our thinking when presented with compelling evidence of better ways to organize society. She was portraying humanity's supposed weakness, their youth and adaptability, as actually being an advantage for the purpose of transformation. More importantly, she was suggesting that successful transformation of humanity would prove that Zephyrian civilization was so obviously superior that even independent evaluation would lead to voluntary submission. "You claim that humans possess this capacity for voluntary transformation," said Hierarch Kyle Thack skeptically. "What evidence supports this assertion?" "Our entire history," Sarah replied without hesitation. "Humans have repeatedly abandoned inferior social systems in favor of superior ones when the benefits became clear. We've transformed from tribal warfare to global cooperation, from chaotic resource competition to organized trade networks, from individual survival focus to species-wide coordination." She was drawing on genuine human historical patterns while reframing them to suggest that humanity had a natural tendency to evolve toward more organized social structures. More importantly, we're here having this conversation instead of launching hopeless military resistance. That alone demonstrates that at least some humans are capable of recognizing superior civilization when they encounter it. Hierarch Nixonder's harmonic patterns shifted to what Sarah recognized as analytical excitement. The behavioral modification protocols required for voluntary transformation would indeed represent a fascinating challenge. Standard domination techniques focus on compliance through fear, but voluntary adoption would require complete psychological restructuring. "Exactly," Sarah said, allowing her own excitement to show through. "Hierarch Nixandra, you understand what this represents, the chance to develop entirely new approaches to civilization expansion. Instead of simply imposing order through force, you could perfect techniques for inspiring voluntary adoption of superior principles." She was encouraging the hierarchs to see humanity as a testing ground for developing new forms of psychological warfare that could be applied to future conquests. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was essentially offering to help them become more effective conquerors in exchange for sparing humanity from immediate destruction. "Such techniques would have applications beyond your species," observed Hierarch Voxmari thoughtfully. "Successfully perfected methods for inspiring voluntary transformation could accelerate future expansion efforts significantly." "Precisely," Sarah agreed. "Instead of spending years reducing each new civilization to rubble and then rebuilding from scratch, you could potentially guide them through voluntary transformation processes that would achieve the same goals with far greater efficiency." The chamber's harmonics were becoming increasingly complex as the seven hierarchs began communicating with each other through frequencies beyond human hearing. Sarah could sense that they were analyzing her proposals from every possible angle, looking for flaws in her logic or hidden traps in her suggestions. Finally, Hierarch Prime Zethnos spoke, his voice carrying new harmonic overtones that suggested significant internal debate had taken place. "Ambassador Chen, your proposals raise questions that require extensive analysis. The concepts you present are unprecedented, as befits the intellectual capabilities of the Fleet Council," Sarah replied respectfully. "These aren't simple military decisions that can be resolved through standard tactical analysis. They require the kind of strategic wisdom that only the most advanced civilizations can bring to bear." She was reinforcing the idea that choosing transformation over destruction was actually a demonstration of greater sophistication, not lesser resolve. More importantly, she was encouraging them to spend time analyzing her proposals instead of proceeding with immediate military action. "The Council requires additional data before reaching final determinations," Ethnos announced. "You will remain aboard this vessel while we conduct comprehensive evaluation of the scenarios you have presented." "Of course, Hierarch Prime," Sarah said, bowing formally. "I'm honored to provide any additional information that might assist in your deliberations." As the chamber began to dim and the seven pillars shifted to private communication frequencies, Sarah allowed herself a moment of cautious hope. She had successfully introduced multiple cognitive viruses into the thinking of the Zephyrian leadership, each one designed to create psychological pressure toward choosing transformation over destruction. More importantly, she had bought humanity time. Every hour the Fleet Council spent analyzing her proposals was another hour for the psychological warfare campaign to work its way through the Zephyrian command structure. But Sarah knew that the most dangerous phase was still ahead. Soon the hierarchs would complete their analysis and reach a decision. When that moment came, she would need to deploy the ultimate weapon in humanity's arsenal, an idea so perfectly designed to exploit the contradictions in Zephyrian psychology that it would either save her species or destroy the most powerful military force in the galaxy. As she was escorted to guest quarters that resembled crystalline caves filled with harmonic lighting, Sarah Chen prepared for the conversation that would determine the fate of every human being in the galaxy. Sarah spent 3 days in the crystalline chambers aboard the Dominion Absolute, watching the Zephyrian fleet through her quarters' transparent walls as the ships maintained perfect formation around the neutral meeting point. The vessels moved in slow, hypnotic patterns that reminded her of a complex dance, their crystalline hulls catching and refracting starlight into rainbow cascades that painted the void in impossible colors. During those 3 days, she could feel the tension building throughout the ship. The harmonic frequencies that permeated every surface had gradually shifted from the ordered patterns she'd first experienced to something more chaotic. Subtle dissonances that suggested the crew was experiencing unusual psychological stress. It was working. The cognitive viruses she had introduced were spreading through the Zephyrian command structure, creating exactly the kind of internal conflict that their crystalline minds were least equipped to handle. When Fleet Commander Zixei finally came to escort her back to the council chamber, Sarah immediately noticed changes in his behavior. His movements were less fluid, his harmonic patterns carried undertones of uncertainty, and his forearms occasionally moved in contradictory directions before correcting themselves. "Ambassador," he said as they walked through corridors that now pulsed with irregular lighting patterns, "the council's deliberations have been extensive. The concepts you introduced have required analysis at levels of complexity unprecedented in fleet tactical planning." "Complex problems deserve thorough consideration," Sarah replied, though internally she was pleased to hear that her arguments had created significant analytical burden for the Zephyrian leadership. "I trust the council has had adequate time to evaluate all aspects of the transformation scenario." "Time has proven insufficient," Zixei admitted, his harmonic pattern taking on what Sarah recognized as frustration. "Each analytical pathway leads to new questions, new considerations that require additional evaluation. The decision matrix has become problematic." They passed through a section of the ship where Sarah could see crew members engaged in what appeared to be heated discussions. The crystalline beings stood in small groups, their bodies resonating with discordant harmonics that created an almost painful cacophony of sound. Several were performing the ritualized movements she had observed before, but their motions seemed jerky and uncoordinated. "Your crew seems distressed," Sarah observed. "The concepts under consideration have created philosophical disruptions throughout the fleet," Zixei acknowledged reluctantly. "Questions regarding the nature of superiority, the purpose of conquest, and the definitions of achievement have propagated through normal communication channels." Sarah felt a thrill of satisfaction mixed with apprehension. The psychological warfare campaign was succeeding beyond her most optimistic projections, but she was also beginning to understand just how dangerous the weapons she was wielding truly were. She wasn't just attacking Zephyrian military doctrine, she was undermining the fundamental cognitive frameworks that held their entire civilization together. They arrived at the council chamber to find a scene of barely controlled chaos. The 7 pillars still maintained their perfect geometric arrangement, but the harmonic patterns emanating from them were a discordant nightmare of competing frequencies. The crystalline structures themselves were pulsing with unstable light patterns that hurt Sarah's eyes to look at directly. "Human Ambassador Chen," Hierarch Prime Zethnos announced, his voice carrying overtones that suggested he was struggling to maintain composure. "The Council has completed its analysis of your proposals. We have reached conclusions." "I am honored to receive the Council's wisdom," Sarah replied formally, though she could sense that something had gone seriously wrong with the Zephyrian decision-making process. "The analysis has revealed fundamental contradictions within established strategic doctrine," reported Hierarch Voxmari, her harmonic pattern cycling through rapid frequency changes that suggested extreme agitation. "The concept of voluntary transformation introduces variables that cannot be reconciled with existing conquest protocols." Hierarch Kilthax's aggressive harmonics had become a harsh, grinding sound that made Sarah's teeth ache. The suggestion that destruction represents inferior achievement creates logical paradoxes that undermine the theoretical foundations of military superiority itself. Sarah realized that she had been more successful than she had dared hope. The Zephyrian leadership wasn't just questioning their approach to humanity. They were experiencing fundamental doubts about the nature of conquest itself. The behavioral modification protocols required for voluntary transformation, added Hierarch Nixandra in harmonics that wavered between frequencies, would necessitate understanding of psychological principles that contradict established theories of inferior species' mental limitations. "Respected Hierarchs," Sarah said carefully, "I sense that my proposals have created analytical difficulties. Perhaps I can clarify some of the concepts that seem to be causing confusion." "Clarification has proven counterproductive," Hierarch Prime Zethnos replied, his ancient voice carrying notes of something that might have been desperation. Each attempt to resolve contradictions has generated additional paradoxes. The decision tree has become infinite. Sarah began to understand the true scope of what was happening. The Zephyrian minds, optimized for clear hierarchical thinking and decisive action, were trapped in recursive loops of analysis that prevented them from reaching any conclusion at all. Every argument she had presented was designed to create logical contradictions that their rigid thinking patterns couldn't resolve. But she hadn't finished deploying humanity's ultimate psychological weapon yet. Honored hierarchs, she said, moving to the center of the platform, I believe I understand the source of your analytical difficulties. You've been trying to evaluate my proposals within the existing framework of Zephyrian strategic doctrine, but that framework may not be adequate for the unprecedented situation we're facing.
Explain, demanded Hierarch Zethnos.
The problem is that you're attempting to apply principles designed for dealing with inferior species to a situation involving a species that may not actually be inferior at all, Sarah said, her voice carrying a tone of respectful revelation. The harmonic dissonance in the chamber intensified dramatically. Sarah had just suggested that humanity might not be inferior to the Zephyrians, a concept so fundamentally contradictory to their worldview that their minds began struggling to process it. Human civilization lacks the technological advancement, military capability, and social organization that defines superiority. Hierarch Voxmari protested, though her harmonic pattern suggested uncertainty rather than conviction. By conventional measures, absolutely, Sarah agreed. But consider this. If humanity were truly inferior, would we be having this conversation at all? If we were just another primitive species destined for elimination, why would the most powerful military leaders in the galaxy be spending days analyzing the best approach to dealing with us? She began walking slowly around the platform, addressing each hierarch in turn. The fact that you're here, engaged in unprecedented levels of strategic analysis, suggests that humanity presents challenges that your standard conquest protocols weren't designed to handle. And what does that tell us about the nature of superiority itself? The question hung in the air like a poison designed specifically for Zephyrian minds. Sarah was suggesting that their inability to quickly resolve the human situation might actually indicate that humanity possessed some form of superiority that their instruments couldn't measure. You imply that our analytical difficulties indicate human superiority rather than Zephyrian thoroughness, Hierarch Kylthak said, his aggressive harmonics becoming almost incoherent. I imply that truly inferior species don't create analytical difficulties for truly superior ones, Sarah replied. When the Zephyrian collective encounters genuinely inferior civilizations, the decision to eliminate them is made quickly and efficiently. But humanity has forced you to question fundamental principles of conquest theory itself. She was turning their analytical paralysis into evidence of human capability rather than Zephyrian confusion. More dangerously, she was suggesting that their established methods for determining superiority might be flawed. Consider what this means, Sarah continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone sharing a profound insight. If humanity can create logical paradoxes that challenge Zephyrian strategic doctrine, if we can force the most advanced military minds in the galaxy to spend days reconsidering basic assumptions about conquest and superiority, then perhaps we represent something entirely new in galactic civilization. Hierarch Nixandra's harmonic pattern shifted to frequencies that suggested she was approaching a mental breaking point. You suggest that humanity possesses capabilities that transcend conventional measurements of species advancement? I suggest that the difficulties you're experiencing in reaching a decision about humanity indicate that we possess at least one capability that exceeds your own, Sarah said, delivering the final cognitive virus with surgical precision. We have forced the Zephyrian collective to doubt itself. The words hit the assembled hierarchs like a physical blow. The harmonic patterns emanating from their pillars became a chaotic symphony of contradiction and confusion. Sarah had just pointed out that humanity had already achieved something that no other species in galactic history had managed. They had made the Zephyrians question their own superiority. Doubt is not a recognized Zephyrian emotional state, Hierarch Prime Zethnos protested, but his voice carried the very uncertainty he was denying. Then what would you call your current analytical difficulties? Sarah asked gently. If not doubt, then what is preventing the Fleet Council from reaching the same kind of rapid, decisive conclusions that have characterized every previous conquest? The chamber fell into a silence broken only by the increasingly discordant harmonics of the seven pillars. Sarah watched as the most powerful military leaders in Zephyrian space struggled to process the logical trap she had constructed around them. She had created a perfect paradox. If the Zephyrians were truly superior, they should be able to easily decide how to deal with humanity. Their inability to reach a quick decision suggested that humanity possessed some form of superiority, but acknowledging human superiority would contradict the fundamental hierarchical principles upon which their entire civilization was based. The logical structures you have introduced are corrosive, admitted Hierarch Vox Mari, her analytical harmonics fragmenting into chaotic noise. They create self-referential loops that prevent conclusive evaluation, because they reveal truths that your existing frameworks aren't designed to handle, Sarah said with apparent sympathy. The Zephyrian approach to understanding the universe has been incredibly successful for 2 centuries, but now you've encountered a species that challenges the basic assumptions underlying that approach. She moved closer to Hierarch Prime Zethnos' pillar, her voice taking on an almost counseling tone. Hierarch Prime, you're experiencing the intellectual growing pains that come with encountering genuinely new forms of consciousness. Humanity represents something unprecedented in your experience, a species that can match your analytical capabilities while operating from completely different philosophical foundations. You claim equality with Zephyrian intellectual capacity? Zethnos asked, his voice wavering between outrage and uncertainty. I claim that humanity has demonstrated the ability to create analytical challenges that your superior intellects cannot easily resolve, Sarah replied. Whether you call that equality, complementarity, or something entirely new is up to you. But the evidence is undeniable. We're having an effect on your thinking that no other species has achieved. The harmonic chaos in the chamber was reaching critical levels. Several of the pillars were now pulsing with unstable frequencies that suggested their occupants were approaching complete analytical breakdown. Sarah realized she was witnessing the first stages of what the psychological warfare specialist had called crystalline cascade failure, the complete collapse of Zephyrian cognitive coherence when faced with unresolvable paradoxes. The concepts you present cannot be processed within standard analytical frameworks, Hierarch Nixandra announced, her voice fragmenting into multiple harmonic layers that created painful echoes throughout the chamber. Resolution requires alternative approaches to strategic evaluation. Which brings us to the heart of the matter, Sarah said, preparing to deploy her final argument. The Fleet Council faces an unprecedented decision. You can proceed with standard elimination protocols, but doing so would mean accepting that there are some challenges that Zephyrian intelligence cannot overcome through analysis. She paused, allowing the implication to settle. Or you can choose the more difficult path, acknowledging that humanity represents a new type of galactic civilization that requires new approaches to interaction. Not superiority or inferiority, but genuine partnership between different forms of consciousness. The word partnership hit the Zephyrian leadership like a seismic shock. Sarah was suggesting something that their hierarchical worldview made literally inconceivable: the possibility of cooperation between equals rather than domination of inferiors. Partnership implies equality of status, Hierarch Kylthax protested, though his aggressive harmonics had devolved into something resembling static. Partnership implies complementary capabilities, Sarah corrected. Zephyrian civilization has achieved technological and organizational perfection. Human civilization has developed psychological and creative capabilities that can generate analytical challenges for even the most advanced minds. Together, these capabilities could achieve something neither species could accomplish alone. She was offering them a way out of the logical trap she had constructed, a framework for thinking about the situation that didn't require them to admit inferiority while also allowing them to avoid the analytical paralysis that was destroying their decision-making capacity. Such cooperation would represent an unprecedented experiment in galactic civilization. Observed Hierarch Prime Zethnos, his voice carrying harmonics that suggested he was grasping for any analytical framework that would allow the Council to function again. Exactly, Sarah agreed. And who better to conduct such an experiment than the most advanced civilization in the galaxy? The intellectual courage required to attempt genuine partnership with an unknown form of consciousness would be far greater than anything demonstrated through conventional conquest. As the chamber's harmonic chaos gradually began to settle into new, unfamiliar patterns, Sarah realized that she had successfully guided the Zephyrian leadership through the psychological transformation that Project Cassandra had been designed to achieve. They were no longer thinking about humanity as prey to be eliminated, but as a puzzle to be solved through cooperation rather than force. But Sarah also understood that she had unleashed forces that went far beyond the scope of her original mission. The cognitive viruses she had introduced weren't just changing Zephyrian thinking about humanity. They were fundamentally altering the philosophical foundations of their entire civilization. The conversation that would determine the fate of both species was about to begin. The negotiations that followed would later be studied in diplomatic academies across the galaxy as the most complex psychological warfare campaign ever successfully executed. But in the moment, as Sarah Chen stood in the council chamber watching the most powerful military leaders in Zephyrian space struggle to rebuild their shattered worldview, she felt only exhaustion mixed with growing apprehension about what she had unleashed. The 7 pillars had stabilized into new harmonic patterns that bore little resemblance to the ordered frequencies she had first encountered. Instead of the crystalline perfection that had defined Zephyrian consciousness for millennia, the hierarchs were now generating complex, almost musical harmonies that seemed to incorporate elements of uncertainty and exploration, concepts that should have been anathema to their rigid mental architecture. The partnership paradigm you described, Hierarch Prime Zethnos said slowly, his ancient voice carrying harmonics that suggested his mind was literally rebuilding itself around new conceptual frameworks, would require fundamental alterations to establish civilization interaction protocols.
Not alteration, Sarah corrected gently, and not...
The same kind of intellectual growth that allowed Zephyrian civilization to develop from primitive crystal formations into the most sophisticated society in the galaxy. She was framing the psychological transformation as a natural progression rather than a revolutionary change, making it easier for the hierarchs to accept without feeling that they were abandoning core principles. Evolution implies improvement over previous states, observed Hierarch Vox Mari, her analytical harmonics now incorporating modulations that suggested genuine curiosity rather than mere data processing. You suggest that cooperation with humanity would represent advancement beyond current Zephyrian capabilities? I suggest that combining Zephyrian organizational excellence with human creative unpredictability could generate capabilities that neither species could achieve independently, Sarah replied. Consider what you've experienced during these negotiations. Has any previous strategic analysis challenged your thinking as thoroughly as this conversation? The question hung in the air like a key turning in a lock. Sarah was asking them to acknowledge that their interaction with humanity had already demonstrated the value of engaging with different forms of consciousness rather than simply eliminating them. The analytical complexities generated by human psychological warfare techniques have indeed expanded the parameters of strategic evaluation, admitted Hierarch Nixandra. Her behavioral modification expertise now focused on understanding rather than controlling alien thought patterns, which suggests that systematic cooperation could generate even more significant advances, Sarah continued. Imagine what Zephyrian civilization could achieve if it had access to the kind of creative problem-solving that allowed humanity to turn a hopeless military situation into a negotiated partnership with relative detachabilities,
as a resource that the Zephyrians could benefit from rather than a threat that needed to be
eliminated. More importantly, she was encouraging them to see the situation as an opportunity for advancement rather than a challenge to their superiority. Fleet Commander Zixhay, who had been observing the proceedings in silence, suddenly stepped forward. His crystalline form was now pulsing with complex light patterns that suggested his consciousness was operating on entirely new frequency ranges. Ambassador Chen, he said, his harmonic voice carrying undertones of what almost sounded like excitement, the systematic analysis of human psychological techniques has revealed strategic possibilities that extend far beyond species interaction protocols. How so, Commander? Sarah asked, though she had a growing suspicion about where his thoughts were leading. The cognitive warfare methods you have employed could be adapted for application against genuinely hostile civilizations, Zixhay explained, his forearms moving in patterns that suggested rapid tactical calculation. Species that pose actual threats to galactic order could be neutralized through psychological manipulation rather than military destruction. Sarah felt a chill of realization. The Zephyrians weren't just learning to cooperate with humanity. They were learning to weaponize the psychological techniques she had used against them. The cognitive viruses that had been designed to save humanity were evolving into something far more dangerous. The implications are significant, agreed Hierarch Keeltax. His aggressive harmonics now transformed into something resembling strategic enthusiasm. Psychological conquest would allow expansion of crystalline order while preserving the populations that could benefit from Zephyrian guidance. You're talking about using these techniques to subjugate other species, Sarah said, her voice carefully neutral despite the horror she was feeling. We are discussing the application of advanced strategic methods to achieve optimal outcomes in future expansion scenarios. Hierarch Prime Zethnos corrected, but his harmonic patterns confirmed Sarah's interpretation. She had created exactly the scenario that Director Martinez had warned her about in the classified briefings. The psychological warfare techniques that humanity had developed to defend themselves were now being adapted by the most powerful military force in the galaxy for use against future targets. Such applications would require extensive cooperation with human psychological warfare specialists, observed Hierarch Vox Mari. The techniques appear to be dependent on understanding the specific cognitive patterns of target species. Indeed, Sarah said slowly, beginning to see the full scope of what was emerging from the negotiations. Effective psychological warfare requires deep knowledge of alien psychology, extensive cultural analysis, and creative approaches to logical manipulation. She was describing capabilities that humanity possessed but the Zephyrians lacked, making human cooperation essential for any future applications of these techniques. In trying to save her species, she had made them invaluable partners in Zephyrian expansion efforts. Partnership with humanity would provide access to these capabilities, Hierarch Prime Zethnos stated, his voice carrying harmonics that suggested he was reaching a significant conclusion. Cooperation would enhance Zephyrian strategic effectiveness while providing humans with the benefits of crystalline organizational principles. A symbiotic relationship, Sarah agreed, though she was beginning to understand that the symbiosis would be far more complex than either species had originally anticipated. Humanity provides creative problem-solving and psychological warfare expertise. The Zephyrian Collective provides technological advancement and organizational structure. The partnership would necessitate integration at multiple levels, added Hierarch Nixandra. Human colonies would require guidance in adopting crystalline social principles, while Zephyrian military units would benefit from training in psychological warfare techniques. Sarah realized that she was no longer negotiating for humanity's survival. She was architecting the foundation for an entirely new form of galactic civilization. The cognitive viruses she had introduced hadn't just changed Zephyrian thinking about conquest. They had created the framework for a hybrid human Zephyrian society that would be far more powerful than either species could achieve alone. Such integration would require careful planning and gradual implementation, she said, her diplomat's training taking over as she began working out the practical details of what they were proposing. Rushing the process could create instabilities in both human and Zephyrian social structures. Agreed, said Hierarch Prime Zethnos. The transformation process would be monitored and adjusted based on ongoing analysis of integration effectiveness. Over the following hours, Sarah found herself engaged in the strangest negotiation of her career, working with the leadership of humanity's would-be conquerors to design a plan for the voluntary merger of their civilizations. The Zephyrians would provide technological advancement, organizational efficiency, and military protection. Humans would contribute creative thinking, psychological warfare capabilities, and the kind of innovative problem-solving that had turned certain extinction into unprecedented opportunity. The details were complex and sometimes disturbing. Human colonies would be gradually reorganized according to Zephyrian principles of social harmony, but with adaptations that preserved the creativity and individualism that made psychological warfare possible. Zephyrian military forces would be trained in techniques for psychological manipulation that went far beyond anything they had previously conceived. The first phase will involve pilot programs on select human colonies, explained Fleet Commander HFY, as they worked through implementation timelines. Volunteers who demonstrate aptitude for crystalline thinking patterns will be integrated into Zephyrian organizational structures, while human psychological warfare specialists will be embedded within fleet tactical planning units, added Hierarch Nixandra. Their expertise will be essential for developing effective approaches to future expansion scenarios. Sarah nodded, though she was increasingly troubled by the implications of what they were creating. What about species that refuse to cooperate? Groups that choose military resistance over psychological transformation? The harmonic patterns from the 7 pillars shifted to frequencies that Sarah recognized as cold calculation. Hierarch Prime Zethno spoke for the council when he replied, such species would be educated regarding the benefits of cooperation through targeted application of psychological warfare techniques. If education proves insufficient, traditional military solutions would be applied. But with greater efficiency, added Hierarch Kiltax, psychological warfare would eliminate the need for prolonged conflicts. Resistant civilizations could be neutralized through cognitive manipulation that would convince them to eliminate themselves or surrender voluntarily. Sarah felt a growing horror at what she had created. The techniques designed to save humanity were being transformed into weapons that would make Zephyrian expansion unstoppable. Future alien civilizations wouldn't even have the option of honorable military defeat. They would be psychologically manipulated into destroying themselves or embracing subjugation. The partnership arrangement represents optimal strategy for both species, Hierarch Prime Zethnos announced as their planning session reached its conclusion. Humanity achieves survival and technological advancement. The Zephyrian Collective gains capabilities that will accelerate galactic expansion while reducing resource expenditure. A mutually beneficial arrangement, Sarah agreed, though the words felt like ash in her mouth. 3 days later, Sarah stood on the bridge of the Harmony's Edge as the diplomatic vessel prepared to return to Earth with news that would change human civilization forever. Through the viewports, she could see the Zephyrian fleet maintaining their perfect formations, but now the crystalline ships seemed less like instruments of destruction and more like the foundation stones of a new galactic order. The psychological warfare campaign had succeeded beyond her wildest dreams and her worst nightmares. Humanity would survive, but the price of survival was becoming junior partners in an empire that would use human psychological techniques to conquer and subjugate every other species in the galaxy. Ambassador, Lieutenant Torres said as he handed her the final communication from the Fleet Council, Earth Command is requesting a full briefing on the negotiation outcomes. Sarah took the datapad and began composing her report, struggling to find words that could adequately explain what had transpired. How could she tell the leaders of Earth that she had saved humanity by transforming them into the psychological warfare division of the most powerful conquering force in galactic history? The irony was bitter and complete. Humanity's greatest gift, the ability to change minds through language, had indeed proven stronger than overwhelming military force. But in demonstrating that power, they had created a hybrid civilization that would be far more dangerous to the galaxy than the Zephyrian Collective had ever been alone. Director Martinez's voice echoed in Sarah's memory. Humanity's gift has never been superior technology or overwhelming force. Our gift is language. She had used that gift to save her species, but in doing so, she had armed their former enemies with psychological weapons that would make resistance to future expansion essentially impossible. As the Harmony's Edge engaged its faster-than-light drives for the journey back to Earth, Sarah Chen stared out at the stars and wondered what kind of galaxy her words would create. Behind her, the Zephyrian fleet was already beginning to move toward their next target, another species that would soon discover that military resistance was futile when your enemies could convince you to destroy yourself with nothing more than carefully chosen words. The age of conventional warfare was ending. The age of psychological conquest had begun. And humanity, in fighting for their survival, had become the architects of a new form of galactic domination that would spread through the stars like a virus made of pure persuasion. Diplomacy had not failed. It had succeeded too well, and in the process it had transformed both conqueror and conquered into something entirely new and infinitely more terrifying than either had been alone. Years later, when xenohistorians tried to understand how the human Zephyrian Collective had achieved complete galactic dominance, without firing a shot in most of their conquest campaigns, they would study the conversations that took place aboard the Dominion Absolute as humanity's final and greatest contribution to the art of war. They would call it the day that words became weapons of mass destruction, and warfare became a matter of psychology rather than physics. They would mark it as the beginning of the end for independent alien civilizations, as one by one they fell not to superior firepower, but to superior arguments that convinced them to surrender their freedom voluntarily. And in classified archives accessible only to the highest levels of the Collective's leadership, they would preserve the recordings of Ambassador Sarah Chen explaining to her Earth Command superiors how humanity had saved itself by teaching the galaxy's greatest predators to hunt with ideas instead of weapons, making them infinitely more dangerous to every other species in existence. The final irony would be noted by historians who understood what had really happened during those 3 days of negotiation. Humanity had won by losing, survived by surrendering, and achieved their greatest victory by ensuring that every other species in the galaxy would eventually face the same choice they had faced: submit or be convinced to destroy yourself. There were no longer any other options. When diplomacy had failed in the conventional sense, humanity had turned words into weapons, and warfare into a form of applied psychology. They had saved themselves by making everyone else in the galaxy infinitely more vulnerable than they had ever been before. And the most terrifying part was that most of their future victims would thank them for it, convinced by perfectly crafted arguments that their subjugation was actually liberation, their conquest was actually cooperation, and their surrender was actually victory. This was humanity's true gift to the galaxy: the power to make any species believe that becoming part of the Collective was not just inevitable, but desirable. It was the ultimate evolution of diplomatic technique, and it made traditional concepts of military resistance completely obsolete. Sarah Chan had succeeded in her mission beyond all possible expectations. She had prevented the destruction of humanity and secured their place in galactic civilization. The fact that she had also doomed every other species in the galaxy to eventual psychological conquest was simply the price that had to be paid for turning words into the most powerful weapons the universe had ever seen.